Chuck Norris managed to maintain his balance despite the handcuffs, shifting his weight at the last second, and the baton came down with vicious power, missing his face by inches. "Next time, I won't miss you, officer." When he had one more chance, Briggs growled, his breath reeked coffee and smoke. "How on earth are you in Millfield?" On this empty section of highway, Chuck's truck was surrounded by 3 unmarked cop cars, their lights flashing against a barren landscape with no witnesses, and blood trickling from his split lip where the initial blow had connected. No cameras. "I told you that." Chuck's response was deadly calm. "I am seeking Mike Bennett." The senior officer glanced at his companion briefly upon hearing the name, a momentary flicker of familiarity. 48 hours prior to Mike's arrival, Chuck had received a mysterious text message. Millfields was having issues. The man who had twice saved Chuck's life in Afghanistan was now kneeling on sun-baked asphalt, with his truck being taken apart while Medallion was being shown. "Don't trust the police. They need aid." Then there was quiet and no more communication. Officer Briggs was never heard of, but Mike's Delta Force medallion, which Chuck had given him after they survived the horrific evacuation in Kandahar, was hanging from a chain around his neck. Briggs lied while carelessly touching the concealed medallion. "But I'm beginning to suspect that you're transporting something illicit in that upscale vehicle." The younger cop, Jensen, who was identified by his nameplate, squirmed uneasily as he barely looked into Chuck's glove compartment. "I'm not finding anything here, sir. Keep looking." Chuck observed that Jensen was reluctant to file it away since he had spent 20 years in special operations, which had sharpened his capacity to remain composed in such circumstances. Jensen took a folded newspaper clipping concerning mysterious disappearances in Millfield County off the console. In the margins, Mike's handwriting was visible. Sir Jensen called, holding up the clipping. "So you might want to see this." Briggs grabbed the paper, his face darkening as he read the headlines. When he turned to face Chuck again, the casual cruelty had changed to something more calculated and dangerous, you know. "Quiet," Briggs said. "Around here, folks who ask too many questions tend to vanish." His fingers tightened on his baton, especially outsiders, and the menace hovered between them. Little did these officers realize that they had just committed the worst mistake of their lives. Chuck Norris was going to become Millfield, not just a friend. "I realize that I've had enough of this." With a grumble, Briggs stuffed the newspaper, clipping into his pocket, and cuffed himself. Jensen paused, his hand lingering over the handcuffs. I responded, "Cuff him, but I'm not sure if we have grounds for it." Briggs's face becomes red. The color red. The younger officer warily walked up to Chuck as Jensen fastened the handcuffs. Chuck saw that Jensen had purposefully left them one click looser than protocol required, and he apologized in a barely audible whisper. Chuck nodded. Barely perceptibly, but in hostile territory, seeing possible allies was vital. Briggs took Chuck by the arm and dragged him to the patrol car. "Let's continue at the station." Despite the fact that the station isn't required, Sheriff Mercer would love to meet a celebrity. Chuck answered coolly. Briggs made a loud noise as he chuckled, and Chuck planted his feet, making them immobile despite having his hands cut behind him. The dishonest officer staggered backward, listening intently, but his firm posture stopped Briggs from pushing him forward. Chuck said softly, "Mike Bennett will be found by me, either with your help or in spite of your meddling." Briggs put his hand in his holster. "Are you threatening a police officer?" He was just presenting the facts. Suddenly, Briggs grabbed Chuck's hand and pressed it to his throat. "You don't give orders here. This isn't Hollywood in Millfield. We have our own rules." As the baton pressed against Chuck's windpipe, his breathing was constant, and he didn't flinch. Interjection from Sir Jensen. Mike experienced what happens to troublemakers in Millfield. They drive a long way to the county line, but never quite make it. A car was approaching, and a dust cloud was visible down the highway. Briggs lowered the bat and reluctantly got him the car he ordered. Now that Chuck was safely buckled up in the back seat, Briggs leaned and closed. After confirming that his eyes were wide enough, Briggs swiftly withdrew and slammed the door through the mesh wire. Chuck saw that Briggs made hostile gestures as a cop cruiser drew away, and the officer expressing Jensen's body language shouted discomfort. Chuck gazed at his truck through the rear glass as they traveled eastward beyond Millfield proper and towards the county boundary. Although Briggs had indicated that the power play was intensifying, Chuck maintained his composure. Mike's location was already being transmitted by the GPS tracker concealed in his boot heel, and the thumb drive holding his findings was securely tucked into a hidden compartment in his belt. The game had started, but Briggs was unaware that he wasn't a cat. As the patrol car bumped along a deserted back road, driving farther out of town, Briggs continued to look at Chuck through the rearview mirror. "You chose the wrong town to play. The heroine." Sheriff Mercer doesn't like outsiders snooping around, according to Brigg, who spoke with satisfaction in his voice. Chuck said nothing, taking the time to observe his surroundings. They purposefully took a route that was hard to follow or track, turning off the main highway onto a number of unmarked dirt roads. Your friend Mike made the same mistake. Briggs kept asking inquiries, obviously wanting to get a response so he could come here with his fancy credentials. Chuck didn't change his look, but he took in every word that confirmed Mike had been present and that something had happened to him. "Stop," Briggs abruptly said to Jensen. "I want to have a proper conversation with our celebrity." With reluctance, Jensen obeyed, bringing the car to a stop next to an abandoned petrol station. The rundown structure was the only structure visible in the desolate grounds, far away from any observers. Chuck was pushed against the automobile as Briggs yanked him out of the rear seat. This act of willful brutality shows how tough you are. Briggs tightened Chuck's chains until they dug into his wrists, and then he punched Chuck in the kidney with a cowardly strike meant to produce the most suffering with the least amount of proof. Chuck took the blow and didn't say anything. He had been extensively trained to resist interrogation techniques throughout his military service. There is still nothing to say, even though this was amateur hour. Briggs made fun of delivering another blow to your friend, who was initially chatty but not so much later. "We should return to the station, sir." Jensen remained close by and appeared uneasy. "Dispatch is requesting updates, so let them know we're investigating a suspect." When Briggs realized that this wouldn't last long, he grabbed Chuck by the throat and pushed him against a patrol car. "What knowledge do you have regarding Mike Bennett's inquiry?" Chuck met his gaze evenly. "I know enough to understand why you're scared." Briggs's face twisted in anger, and he drew back his fist, but Jensen moved forward, sir. A pickup truck was approaching, kicking up dust in the distance. Briggs cursed, releasing Chuck, and as Jensen helped him into the back seat, he whispered, "Whatever you're planning, do it soon, because we're not going to the station." The pickup truck passed without stopping. However, the brief interruption had disrupted Briggs' rhythm, so he slammed the driver's door and said, "Take us to the warehouse." He said, "Jensen Sheriff will want to handle this personally." As they pulled back onto the dirt road, Chuck took note of their direction and landmarks, and the hidden GPS in his boot continued to transmit, and now he had confirmation that Mike had been looking into something important. Something worth killing for the warehouse appeared as a crest of the hill, a large metal structure surrounded by chain-link fence, isolated from the main town. Two men with shotguns guarded the gate, watching as a patrol car approached the sheriff's expecting us. One guard asked, "Get something he'll want to see," and Briggs rolled down his window. The rear seat, the gate opened, and Chuck noticed 6 cars parked next to the building, expensive SUVs that didn't seem appropriate for a small town. A man wearing an immaculate sheriff's outfit stood in the middle of the warehouse, which had been transformed into a makeshift operations center. Computer stations lined one wall, and what looked to be confiscated goods were kept in a separate area. The call from Sheriff Mercer Briggs brought you a guest. Mercer regarded Chuck. His wrinkled features tilted in a passive manner. Chuck Norris finally announced, "I'm looking for Mike Bennett, a long way from Hollywood." Chuck answered plainly. M's face remained unchanged, but his eyes changed. Uncuffing Briggs, Chuck resisted the urge to rub his wrists as the cuffs were removed, not wanting to show any signs of discomfort. Mercer ordered the room to be cleared quickly, leaving only Chuck the sheriff and 2 armed deputies by the door. Our guest were not barbarians. His southern accent was thick, purposefully a performance. Briggs hesitated before complying. Jensen and the others were gone. Bennett, Mike. According to Mercer, a former Delta Force private security consultant arrived here when they were alone to inquire about traffic stops and the whereabouts of missing people. The Mercer side was asked by Chuck, who seemed disappointed by the directness. "Norris, mister?" He pointed to the warehouse, saying, "Millfield has fallen on hard times. We found alternative revenue streams. Where is Mike?" "You must understand how things work. Small towns have their own systems and economies." Chuck echoed that Mercer's act of civility had somewhat crumbled, making your friend a liability in my position. Mercer grabbed the sheriff's wrist and twisted it behind his back as Chuck moved with practiced quickness, closing the distance before the deputies could react. In the same action, he released Mercer's sidearm, placed the sheriff as a human shield, and called him off. Chuck gave the command while the deputies brandished their rifles. "Stand down," Mercer said, squinting as Chuck squeezed his wrist. "Now, what about Mike?" Chuck said coolly. Basement level cell 3 was destroyed by Mercer's poison. "We haven't checked on him in days, so I'm not sure whether he's still alive." Chuck's jaw tightened. The line had been crossed. They weren't just dishonest police officers. They were something far worse. "Take me to him," Chuck said. "Now move." Chuck gave Sheriff Mercer instructions and led him to a metal door that said, "Storage." The 2 deputies trailed behind, their rifles still out, but they weren't willing to take the chance of striking their boss in the stairway. Beyond the door, darkness fell, lit only by a few emergency lights, and the air grew colder with the distinct smell of dampness and neglect. At the bottom, Mercer directed his previous confidence, which was replaced by compliance. The basement level held a row of makeshift cells, shipping containers that had been modified with bar doors and little ventilation. The majority stood, with nothing to do, and cell 3 was chillingly plain. As they got closer to the 3rd container, Chuck recalled, tightening his hold on Mercer's arm. A faint cough came from inside Chuck, and his pulse quickened, but his exterior stayed calm. He ordered one of the deputies to open the cell door, and despite the low light, he saw a figure huddled in the corner. Chuck saw Mike Bennett right away. His friend was hardly recognizable, his face swollen from beatings, his clothes torn, and his body emaciated from neglect. With a tone of incredulity, Mike's voice was almost audible. "I'm here, brother," Chuck confirmed, he said, holding Mercer tightly. "We're getting you out." Mike tried to stand but fell, against the wall, too frail to bear his own weight. The decision was decided for Chuck when the lights abruptly went out, leaving the basement in complete darkness out of instinct. Chuck needed to move fast, but the logistics were difficult. He couldn't keep Mercer under control while assisting Mike. Chuck pushed Mercer in the direction of the cops and dodged a gunshot that rippled through the small area before Mercer's agonized cries, "Cease fire, you idiot!" were heard by the sheriff, who then yelled, "You hit me." Chuck retreated by taking advantage of the brief uncertainty. "Can you move at all?" he murmured into Mike's cell. With assistance, Mike was able to hold his friend's weight. Flashlight. Rays searching through the darkness found them as Chuck led him down the wall, away from the door and farther into the shadows. Mercer gave the command, his voice tense with anguish and rage, and the deputies proceeded carefully, moving their lights over the inmates, As one beam moved inches away from their location, Chuck stayed motionless and controlled his breathing. "We must get you medical help, sir." One of the deputies informed Mercer that the shoulder wound was bleeding heavily until we located them. A door crashing open reverberated from above, followed by many footsteps descending the stairs, but Mercer's voice was becoming weaker. "FBI, down your weapons." Chaos broke out in the basement. There was gunfire, shouting, the sound of people hitting the ground. And then, a familiar voice as Chuck dragged Mike farther into the darkness. "Chuck, Michael, it is FBI agent Ryan Jensen. You can now leave the area, because the predator had turned into the victim and a share of Merc was taken. Away in handcuffs, bloodied and vanquished. The power dynamics in Millfield had changed forever. How did you find us?" Chuck questioned as FBI officers cleaned up the area, assisting Mike onto a chair in the main office of the warehouse. "We've been watching your GPS tracker since you turned it on, so you knew I was coming." Ryan Jensen, now publicly showing his FBI credentials, gave Chuck a glass of water. "We were contacted by Mike before his darkness. I was already undercover here for 6 months," Ryan revealed. "When you texted Mike about coming to Millfield, his secure server instantly sent it to our team, Chuck." Chuck then passed the water to Mike, who gratefully drank. "What did you discover Mike doing despite his weakened state?" "For months, we have been constructing a case against Mercer." Mike's eyes blazed with systemic corruption, traffic checkpoints that target out-of-state vehicles carrying expensive goods or cash, and civil forfeitures without due process for those who refused to disappear. However, we required hard proof that explicitly linked him to the operation. A female FBI agent approached the laptop, "Sir, you must see this. We have access to their financial records. The transaction records on the screen. Flowing millions of dollars through property and offshore accounts, blackmailing material. For 15 years, Millfield was more than just a dishonest sheriff's department. It was a center of sophisticated criminal activity." The agent explained that it began with routine traffic ticket shakedowns and progressed to stealing drugs from evidence, then to full-fledged racketeering and human trafficking. Chuck asked piercingly. Weakly, Mike nodded. 3 cells. "There's more." The Down-for-Mine family of 4 refused to sell their farm to Mercer Shell Company, and they were planning to export tomorrow. A medical team showed up there to tend to Mike and the other rescue inmates as they were getting ready to take Mike to the hospital. He grabbed Chuck's arm. Mike said hurriedly, "Millfield is not alone. 3 other countries have the same operation, but they have different sheriffs and the same playbook. The password for my study files is Kandahar Delta 7. And Ryan's gaze darkened as we expected more names. As Mike was being carried away, Chuck turned to Ryan and recognized a reference right away. "We're going to find out how far this goes." There was an extraction call signed from Afghanistan, pointing to the expanding stack of evidence that FBI tech personnel were cataloging. Ryan responded. Mercer maintained through records, and the old-fashioned egotist believed he was untouchable via the warehouse windows. Chuck observed as more FBI vehicles pulled up. The operation was growing quickly, and agents were leaving T-Town. "What happened to Millfield?" Chuck asked. Ryan's face was grim but resolute. Justice was long delayed, and the town's dark secret was finally revealed in the light of day like a gaping wound. However, as Chuck discovered, the infection had spread much more widely than anybody had anticipated. As Chuck sat in the neighborhood diner going over the information Mike had assembled, dawn broke over Millfield. The FBI had set up a command center at the sheriff's office, where agents were going through years' worth of records. As Ryan walked in with a silver-haired woman in her 70s, the bell above the door jingled. "This is Marvette Wilkins, Chuck." Ryan, in fact, has been our town's eyes and ears. She owns this diner. "It's about time someone showed up," Margaret replied, her worn face remaining apathetic, but her eyes assessing Chuck with smart intelligence. Margaret has been recording Mercer's movements for years. Chuck nodded respectfully as Ryan told that her grandson vanished 2 years ago during a routine traffic stop. "We need your assistance because civilian assets, particularly those with personal drive, can turn out to be more valuable than official ones." Ryan persisted in laying out a map of the neighboring counties on the table, and Mike's data supports our thoughts. "This network stretches beyond Millfield. Each of these 3 counties has its own Sheriff Mercer. There aren't enough FBI agents to relocate." Concurrently across all sites, Margaret also said, "If we hit one, the others will scatter." Chuck looked at the map, noting that the counties were strategically positioned to control major transportation routes into the area. Ryan confirmed that a coordinated strike was necessary, but we also need more manpower. The diner door opened, again, letting in a steady stream of people, including a former judge who was forced to retire early after questioning Mercer's cases, a mechanic whose garage was seized for refusing to launder, Ma clarified, and they're prepared to retract it. Chuck noted that rather than training operatives, the assembled group consisted of resolute individuals who were deeply familiar with their neighborhoods and hungry for justice. "We are not requesting that they interact directly," Ryan explained after observing Chuck's facial expression. "The former judge steps forward, and the FBI will conduct the takedowns with only intelligence collection and logistical help. I still have contacts in all of these counties' courthouses, including clerks, best friends, and people who have been avoiding my repair shop out of fear rather than cooperation. Provide services for 2 counties' police cars. No one pays attention to the man changing their oil," the mechanic remarked. Chuck nodded slowly, saying that a civilian intelligence network that was properly run could give them the advantage they required. When he asked, "Should we start?" Margaret's smile was thin, but determined that we already had, as we were making calls and forming an alliance while you were saving Mike. "The question is, are you all the way?" Chuck answered right away, and everyone around him showed the same level of resolution that the team had brought together. After 48 hours of rigorous preparation, 4 counties' actions were coordinated. Chuck, Ryan, and a tactical FBI team set up shop outside the Garfield County Sheriff's Department, which is said to be the network's hub. Ryan reported looking at his watch for the first time since we began surveillance, and Margaret's intel confirmed that Sheriff Holloway is meeting with all 3 of the other corrupt sheriffs tonight. The timing couldn't be more ideal. Chuck noted that, in contrast to Mike's spontaneous rescue, this operation had been carefully organized with each team member wearing communication devices and tactical gear, as well as having backup plans and clear OB objectives. Reports from Team 2. Through their earpieces, the Command Team 3 received the report that the power substation was secure and prepared to disconnect power. His eyes were on every exit, and nobody left without our knowledge. Chuck made one last check of his gear. His job was to enter the sheriff-protected server room and insert the specialized disk, which would get over security measures and enable the FBI to download vital material in 60 seconds after it was announced. "Chuck, you can move forward with Phase 1 utilizing the data that the former deputies gave you." Chuck went stealthily around the outside of the building to an unguarded service door. The lock gave way easily to the specialized equipment that the FBI tech team had provided. Inside the building, there was a silent skeleton crew that worked the night shift, most of whom were stationed at the front desk or on patrol. Chuck moved quickly and skillfully through the dimly lit hallways, avoiding the well-known security camera placements. The server room was precisely where the blueprints showed a reinforced door that required both keycard and code access. Chuck connected a small electronic device to the card reader, which cycled through potential access combinations in seconds. Chuck then found the main server and inserted the specialized drive package that Ryan had delivered. He reported that, He was quietly starting to download the cop copy that Ryan had responded to. As Teams 2 and 3 carried out Phase 2, the building of Chuck received comparable reports from the other county operations, all of which were running smoothly. As 2 sheriff's deputies tried to seize the evidence, the server room door flew open, and they paused when they saw Chuck already holding his FBI-issued credentials. Guys. Calmly, Chuck suggested that you collaborate outside, while sirens screamed as more FBI cars gathered at a spot where the download finished with a gentle beep. Years of illegal behavior are now safe since the evidence system was breached. Chuck stated that the infiltration was over and that Sheriff Holloway and his 3 colleagues were now being held in different interrogation rooms with expressions that showed differing levels of astonishment and defiance. Chuck watches them as FBI specialists process the confiscated evidence via a one-way glass. 15 years of dishonesty. According to Ryan, preliminary reports of more than $30 million in stolen assets, 26 persons are missing and thought to have died from drug trafficking. Distribution. It's worse than we anticipated. Watkins, the FBI assistant director, entered without mentioning Chuck and Ryan's outstanding job, and we now have concurrent operations going on in all 4 counties, leaving the network fully exposed. As to who is conducting the interrogations, Chuck questioned, "Why am I here?" Watkins answered, "Hawley is asking for you specifically," adding that he will only speak with the Norris guy. Chuck and Ryan looked at one another, and I wondered why he said he knew about other operations. A few minutes later, Chuck was sitting opposite from a towering, imposing man whose pricey suit stood out from the handcuffs that were normally used to hold him. He would only divulge this knowledge to you. "I'm almost amazed by the operation you've planned." Mr. Norris Holloway started his abrupt drawl with precise measurement. "This is a conversation," Chuck said calmly. "I'm here to listen. You have information. Do you realize what you stepped into? This isn't some backwoods corruption plan, is it?" The comms hallway facade crumbled a little. "We answer questions you don't want to know, and what we've constructed here is only a small part of something far bigger. People who will not be amenable to this disruption in their company. Names are still using Holloway." Holloway leaned forward at Choose Q. "Congressman, I could give you names that would surprise you. Even some 3-letter agencies that profit from our arrangement are federal judges." Chuck didn't say anything, "Or you might be making up threats to get a better deal because you believe this is the end of it." Holloway gave a sour laugh. Holloway's expression changed to show genuine fear beneath the bravado. "Because I need protection. When they find out what has been compromised, they'll clean the house, starting with anyone who might talk. That's the FBI's decision, not mine, but they'll listen to your recommendation. We're middle management at best, so the real power won't even feel this pinprick." Holloway demanded that I provide proof of my insurance coverage. We all preserved names, dates, and transactions from decades before. Chuck closely examined the individual who held the key to our biometrics and a password sequence for the safety deposit boxes in each of the 4 county banks. As Chuck approached the door, he said, "We'll check out your claims, and if they check out, the FBI will consider witness protection." Alay cried out to him, "The same system that you haven't won but have just disclosed is what's happening in these counties, Norris. How deep the rabbit hole goes." Chuck hesitated for a second before leaving without saying anything outdoors. Watkins and Ryan waited anxiously. "And he's afraid. Chuck is valuable since he reported." The last encounter was not just with a dishonest sheriff, but also with a system that stretched well beyond the boundaries of 4 rural counties. 3 weeks later, Chuck sat next to Mike's hospital bed and watched as his friend's strength gradually returned. A news anchor in the corner of the TV covered the ongoing fallout from what the media had called a conspiracy involving 4 counties. The reporter reported that 37 people, including 4 county sheriffs, 12 deputies, 3 judges, and countless municipal politicians, were indicted by federal grand juries today for their roles in the corruption network. According to FBI officials, the probe has broadened to look at potential links to corruption at the state and federal levels. Mike motioned Chuck to lower the level. "I never imagined it would get this big," he added. After weeks of mistreatment, in a cell, the voice is still raspy. The FBI has formed a special task team. Holloway wasn't kidding Chuck when he stated that his insurance records opened doors to investigations in 7 additional states. Chuck's attitude softened a little when they discovered remains at a Mercer property. DNA testing is in progress, but closed eyes are momentarily processing the somber news. At least she will have answers. They were interrupted by a knock on the door as Ryan came in with a folder stamped with FBI seals. "You want to see this?" he said, passing the folder to Chuck. This marked the official conclusion of the Millfield investigation, with all of the victims and offenders in custody, and the higher powers hallway mentioned. Chuck inquired Ryan's attitude, changed to one of caution, which is still beyond my clearance level. But I can tell you that a number of extremely anxious people in Washington are abruptly retiring early because Ryan might turn to Chuck after returning to the ranch. As both men reflected on the events of the previous month, which had started as a search for a missing friend and revealed a cancer corruption that had spread through several levels of government, Chuck nodded for a while. "I could use some quiet," Mike said. "The people of Millfield have started a story that says when corrupt officials abuse their power, Chuck Norris appears to set things right." Chuck gives a small smile. Outside the hospital window, Mike acknowledged that legends can be helpful at times. America carried on with its operations without realizing that a tiny but important amount of its covert corruption had been exposed into the light, and that the cleanup was just getting started.